This is TWiT.
Now, I think we should celebrate with some brown stuff.
Well, I finally ran through all of the gifts and things and actually had to go shopping. And I was in the local liquor store where there still is no American bourbon, but there is Scottish.
Benromach.
Benromach, which I had not had before. And which is funny because it's been around a long time. It's nominally a Speyside. I mean, it's in the county of Moray, which includes the Speyside. This is the larger area of which they once known as Elginshire, because the biggest town is Elgin, which is about 25,000 people. They got renamed as the Moray Shire in 1919. The second largest town is Forres, which is about 10,000 people, which is where Benromach is. Of course, we've mentioned this before. The northern part of Scotland here has had humans on it going back to Neolithic times. Although the area was this specific area, this particular inlet where Taurus is, or Forres is, it was mentioned by Ptolemy in 100 AD. So it's also got a very famous carved rock by the Picts called the Sweno Stone, which was a commemoration of a successful battle of the Picts against the Norse, likely around 900 AD, plus or minus 50 years. It's also the location in Shakespeare's Macbeth of Duncan's castle. In fact, when the three witches are meeting on the moorlands, those are real moorlands outside of Forres. So you can go, stand where where Shakespeare was describing these locations. They're real locations. 1898, the original distillery is built by Duncan McCallum and F.W. Brickman. They run for a whole 2 years, make their first products in 1900, and then shut down. They get run out of money. McCallum gets some additional money and reopens it as the Forres Distillery instead of calling it Benromach. Just in time for World War I, where they shut down again. They try and start up after, run for a few years, shut down through Prohibition, and then World War II. By 1953, it is sold to Distillers Company, DCL, which is the path to Diageo eventually. Who ran it for 30 years, from 53 to 83, and then it got mothballed, shut down for about a decade, where it was acquired by the Urquhart family. Now, and when mothballed meaning stripped for parts, there was nothing left. Now, who are the Urquharts? Well, the Urquharts own Gordon and MacPhail. And Gordon MacPhail is another very old organization inside of Scotland. They were founded in 1895. And these were grocery and wine merchants, James Gordon and John Alexander MacPhail. But one of their early employees was a fellow by the name of John Urquhart, who began there as an apprentice. And he's specifically focused on the whiskey side of the business. So they're grocery and wine merchants, but they were bringing in barrels of whiskey and eventually got into, you got to pick your casks. And then they started doing blends. And a lot of this was Urquhart's work. He was also instrumental in the idea of doing long-aged whiskey, where he started buying casks that they weren't going to touch for a decade or 2 decades, or in one case, 6 decades. And he became a senior partner when the founders passed. He took over the business entirely, and it's been in the Urquhart family ever since, 4 generations now. So after John, his son George ran it, and then his sons Ian and David and Michael. And right now, the 4th generation operates Gordon MacPhail. So Neil is the non-exec chairman. Stephen Rankin runs the Prestige Group. Stuart is the operations director, and Richard is head of sales for the Americas. That's a lot of Urquharts. So they acquired, they'd always wanted to have their own distillery, and they bought Benromach as this very small distillery in 1993, refitted it over 5 years. And in 1998, Bonnie Prince Charles, now King Charles, opened the distillery for them. And coincidentally, part of this story has to do with a fellow by the name of Keith Cruikshank, who he was in the distilling business already in Scotland, but he got hired on at that restart in 1998 to be the manager of the company within a couple of years, and has been through the run of Benromach, only left this year to join another small distillery in Speyside called Colburn. This is a small place. They don't make a ton of whiskey, but while they are in the Spey region, it's much more of a Highland style, and it's peated, which is weird. It's at 12 ppm, which is a very low. They call it just a whisper of peat smoke, although I have tasted this, And that's a pretty loud whisper. You could hear it coming. I would consider it a peated whiskey at 12 ppm. And generally they say peated is like 10 to 15 ppm, as opposed to Lagavulin at 40, which would be significantly peated. And then there are, of course, the crazy ones like the high peats in the 60 to 100, the Octomore at 300. I don't know why you would do that to yourself. And when we remind ourselves why we put peat into whiskey in the first place, it's because it was the cheapest way to dry the malt. So, before the Industrial Revolution, if you go out to the early 1800s, where whiskey is still, everything's peated. Spey was no different. They made it then. Now, there were different kinds of peat, of course, right? The Islay whiskeys are what the seaweed peat versus the heather peats in the north. But which begs the question, how does peat get made from seaweed in the first place? And the answer, of course, is that the land of those islands is still rising from the Ice Age. And so, it takes several hundred years to make peat. So the 10,000-year-old peat, the seaweed that's now well on dry land and has become peat, is why we get that sort of iodine type peat that the Islas are well known from. And this is very much heather peat, so it's not that style. Why did they go away from peat? Because peat got expensive and cheaper drying materials were available. And that cheaper drying material was coal. So as the coal revolution takes a hold in Scotland, and then railways, the cheapest way to dry your malt becomes coal driven. And nobody likes to flavor coal, so they just use it for heat. They don't use it for taste. And it was the Ardmore Distillery in 1898, around the time that Benromach was being formed, that was the first to switch to coal for their heat. And that's why Islay is still peated, because when you're on an island, it's kind of tricky to make a railway. So all of the mainlanders switched over to the lower cost things, and the Islays were sticking with their peat. And so Speysides, as soon as the train line started coming through, they switched across to coal as quickly as possible. And by the end of World War II, there's literally no peat left in the northern parts of Scotland. They just stopped doing it. It's too expensive, and this is a much more efficient way to go about it. Now, as whiskey gets more popular in the 50s and the 60s, some start adding in peat because it's got some character to it. But then when you get into a downturn in the 80s, the peat goes away again. So the fact that Benromach calls himself Speyside with traditional peating is interesting. There are very few. I mean, even Balvenie once in a while does a peat week, where they do use a bit of malted peat barley to do the flavors there. This is a small operation. They don't obviously grow their own barley. Most don't. They actually use they purchase the barley for the big malt houses already peated to specification. They turn it into wort using a combination of both brewer's yeast and distiller's yeast, typically 3 to 5 day fermentation. 3 would be normal, 5 would be long, but it's all hand operations here. They have no automation whatsoever. So they literally ferment until they're happy with the ABV and sort of the texture of that early wort. They use large wooden washbacks, only 11,000 liters, tiny washbacks. There's 4 of them. And then they only have 1 pair of stills, and they're some of the smallest stills in the business. The wash still is 7,500 liters, and the spirit still is 5,000 liters. Now, this has a consequence in that there's only so much room for reflux. So it tends towards a spicier whiskey to use these small stills. Near as I can tell with everything I've read, there's only 2 people who are actually involved in the distilling process inside of Benromach at all. So it's very, very personal, and they run a small operation, 500,000 liters a year, and their Benage warehouses only hold about 8,000 casks. But they're big believers of using sherry in their aging, very Speyside thing to do. And so they use both sherry casks and what are known as now being talked about as sherry seasoned casks. This is the modern way, because there's simply not enough sherry produced for the amount that the whiskey industry needs. You can now buy barrels to specification from sherry producers. You can even choose whether you use European or American oak, and they will put sherry in it for 3 years for the purpose of treating that barrel so that you can use it for sherry aging. This is different from traditional sherry casks in the fact that traditional sherry casks are almost entirely European oak, no other kinds. They tend to be very large and heavy barrels, 500 liters being normal, and they are used repeatedly for sherry. And so they build up a character that when you finally get them for use in whiskey, has a lot of depth of flavor, and typically sherry finishes are short, a few months at most. These sherry seasoned casks don't have that same impact, and so you need to age for longer in those barrels. But there's been some special editions, sherry casking in American oak, that are very popular and kind of special. This is not one of these. It uses very traditional approaches. The Benromach 10 was not necessarily destined to be a 10. They had come up with a new recipe, and this is from Cruikshank's interview on the topic, and they were thinking probably be a 12 or a 15, but somewhere around 9 years, the flavor was coming up so nicely that they decided it was really great at 10, and so they made it a 10. And that gives it a distinct advantage. For a Scottish single malt, it's $50. It's just not that expensive. And so bottled at 43%, and you can't smell the peat coming in. It's not even boozy. He's mostly smelling a bit of wood, and a bit of the barley flavors are still in there. But boy, when you drink it, it's like, wait a second, that's smoky. Now, it's not hugely smoky, but it's definitely the dominant flavor. But there's also a lot of that spicy kind of, I know it comes from the barley, that they've got a lot more of the character, that sort of sharpness. That they haven't pulled the sulfurs quite as heavily, so it's got a little bitter, a little bite. It's got some clout to it. It's not real mouth-filling and creamy, but it drinks nice. And yeah, very warming. Like, you definitely had a good sip of whiskey there. This is a funny Speyside because it's peated. It's not a special edition. Every Benromach 10 is like this. I'd consider it an excellent intro whiskey to peat. If you've never gone into peat before, I would go here. It's a great place to start.
Very good. Richard Campbell, thank you for the whiskey pick of the week. Thank you, Paul Thurrott, for being such a grump. And I must say, this is the first Windows Weekly with not one but two references to Shakespeare in it, which is pretty amazing.